Thank you for joining us today, everyone. My name is Courtney Weatherby. I'm a research analyst with the Southeast Asia program at the Stimson Center, and I'm delighted to welcome all of you for a conversation today with our non-resident fellow, William Weiss, and Marvin Ott and Yun Sun. So I'm going to give everyone a moment to connect to audio, and then we'll begin the presentations. Before we get started, I just want to give a very brief logistical note to everyone who's on the call. So this is a roundtable, and so in the interest of promoting conversation, much like we would if we were having a in-person event at the Stimson Center, we've allowed the chat box. So please feel free to go ahead and provide thoughts and comments in the chat box throughout today's discussion. However, if you have a question that you want to direct to the moderators, please separately submit that to the Q&A function. I will be helping to read those questions into the chat and direct them to people. So please go ahead, put questions into the Q&A box, but you're welcome to use the chat box to have a conversation on the side as the discussion moves forward. So it looks like we are probably set with the number of people coming in. I'm not seeing huge jumps in number of attendees. So with that noted, I am going to happily turn things over to William Weiss. So
thank you. Thank you very much, Courtney. And good afternoon, everyone. Everyone on the East Coast, good evening, a late good evening to our friends in Southeast Asia. Wherever you are, we're so glad that you could join us for this event on China and Southeast Asia. As advertised, my name is Bill Wise. I chair the Southeast Asia Forum at Stimson Center. The forum is a new project of the Southeast Asia program at Stimson. Our mission is to promote, facilitate, and expand the study of Southeast Asia at colleges and universities and research institutions. But our scope really is broader. We also want to encourage persons in government, in NGOs, and the private sector to focus on Southeast Asia and US relations with the region. This is the third Southeast Asia Forum event in our inaugural year, 2020, and our second virtual Wednesday seminar. We'll host two more seminars in October, 2 in November and 1 in December. We're very grateful to Henry Howard, member of our advisory council, for providing the seed money for these webinars. We also appreciate the support of our partners, the U.S. Philippine Society, the U.S. Indonesia Society, the U.S. ASEAN Business Council Institute, and the Southeast Asia League of Students at SAIS. Today, our discussion focuses on a fundamental issue in Southeast Asia, the region's relationship with China. We titled our event, China and Southeast Asia, Balanced and Centered, and please note the title ends with a question mark. There has in fact been a veritable flood of books released this year on the subject of Southeast Asia and China, and Stimson and other research institutions have had conducted numerous seminars and interviews with authors of these books. I am told there may be as many as 6 issued this year. We will have one of the authors, one of these recent authors, Murray Hebert, here for our discussion of Indonesia in a November webinar. Today, we'll explore some of the basic questions about the relationship between Southeast Asia states individually and collectively and with China, from the perspective of both China and Southeast Asia. What are China's strategic goals in Southeast Asia? What means is China employing soft power, hard power, diplomacy, influence operations, trade, military force to achieve these goals? How effective is China in pursuing its objectives in the region? What are the differences among Southeast Asia states in their respective apprehension of China and their approaches in response? Can we identify differences in China policy between mainland Southeast Asia and maritime Southeast Asia? How do these differences strengthen or weaken the Southeast Asians' collective response to China through their regional organization, ASEAN? We may find ourselves agreeing, we probably will find ourselves agreeing, that most Southeast Asia states seek to balance the major powers, including but not limited to China and the US, so that they can maintain autonomy in their own affairs. We may also find, to some extent, that these states would like China to appreciate ASEAN unity ASEAN centrality, if you will. Is this approach by the Southeast Asians realistic? Is it sustainable, even desirable? China may have significantly different plans for the region than Southeast Asia can accommodate. Is Chinese policy realistic or sustainable? Well, to discuss these and other questions, we have two experts well known in the field. Marvin Ott, my former colleague at SAIS, now teaching a Southeast Asia course at Johns Hopkins Homewood campus, is a prolific writer on the region. He has a long record of service in government and academia. Yun Sun, my current colleague at Stimson and director of the China program there, is equally prolific in writing and speaking on China and China's relations with its neighbors, including Southeast Asia. I encourage our audience to read both their bios in the material we have previously provided. Our format today is pretty simple. We'll begin with a discussion among the three of us, getting some of these important issues out on the table. Two key bits of information. First, we'll be taking your questions, discussing your questions after the panelist discussion, which will be perhaps a half hour. And second, this webinar video is being recorded. So, Yun, let's begin with you and the view from Beijing and elsewhere in China. To set up our discussion, what are China's strategic goals in Southeast Asia? How effective is China in employing its instruments of power to achieve these goals?
Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Bill, for convening this meeting. Now that we have been trying to set this up for quite a while, so I'm really glad that we get to do it. I'll focus on how China views Southeast Asia from the Chinese strategic perspective. So we have this discussion. So where does Southeast Asia really fit in China's periphery diplomacy? Because under Xi Jinping, the priority of China's foreign policy is defined as in its periphery, so primarily Asia. So which sub-region in the Asia broader region is the most important for China? And I would argue that among all the sub-regions on the Chinese border, the Southeast Asia is the primary location or primary direction where China is trying to consolidate its influence. Because if you look at the issue that where China sees itself as having most competitive relationship with the United States, we would see the issue of South China Sea is very much in the center of Southeast Asia. Then a little bit earlier with a rebalanced Asia strategy, now with the Indo-Pacific strategy, the issue of the promotion of democracy as spearheaded by the political reform and the democratization of Myanmar, and then now potentially also having its impact in other Southeast Asian countries. Basically, this wave of democratization is also a key concern for China and another sore spot between China and the United States. So compared to other sub-regions, I would say Southeast Asia is an area where China feels that the most need to consolidate its influence. Because if you look at South Asia, India inevitably plays a dominant role, although China denies India's exclusivity. In Northeast Asia, China is working very hard on the Korean Peninsula, but the security dilemma and the security threats in Northeast Asia is very unlikely to be removed in the near future. And although the Belt and Road Initiative, especially the Belt, arguably is primarily focused on Central Asia, so through the stance into Europe, the development or the progress that China has been making in that area is not very easy, and it has been full of obstacles, especially given Russia's traditional influence in that region. So I would say that if you look at Xi Jinping's foreign policy priority, which is periphery and Asia, and look at the comparative analysis of each sub-region's advantages and weaknesses for China, I would say that Southeast Asia is an area where China has identified to be the primary direction for influence and the power consolidation. Does this mean that China has been successful? I think it depends on the region. So in the Chinese narrative, there's a very clear distinction between mainland Southeast Asia and maritime Southeast Asia. Because look at the geography, mainland Southeast Asia is almost seen as a natural extension of China's territory southwards. So with with a shared border with the mainland Southeast Asian countries, I think the Chinese will see that its influence in mainland Southeast Asia should be absolute. But I think that conviction is much less certain in maritime Southeast Asia, which China has traditionally perceived as either allies or sphere of influence of the United States. So I think one, it depends on which region we're talking about. Two, I think it also depends on which field we're talking about. Well, we know that with Belt and Road, China has taken pride in the infrastructure finance and the development goals that China is pushing through Southeast Asia. And I would say in mainland Southeast Asia, the Mekong initiative has been relatively successful. If you look at the achievements and look at the records. I think the Chinese Belt and Road, I would argue, is much less successful coming to maritime Southeast Asia, regardless of what China has promised the Philippines but has not transpired, or what China and Indonesia has agreed to do, but in the end have had realistic difficulty to push forward. Even in the case of Malaysia, we saw that with the last election in Malaysia, there have been hiccups and reversals of the project that Chinese had signed up. So I think it depends on the areas that we're referring to and specific country cases as well. Thank you, Bill.
Thank you very much. Marvin, first of all, I'd like to offer you the opportunity, if you have something to add to Yun's comments on what China is trying to achieve in Southeast Asia, or how China is extending its influence in the region, please do that at the beginning of your remarks. But otherwise, I'd like to ask you how you would characterize the challenge that China poses to Southeast Asia states collectively, and perhaps if you can divide between mainland and maritime Southeast Asia, the challenge may be different in your view in these two areas.
Okay, thanks, Bill. First of all, just a quick comment. It's a pleasure to be here on two grounds. One, the topic, and as you noted, there's proliferation suddenly of books and attention to the question of Southeast Asia and the relationship with China. That interest, in my view, has been long overdue. I think it's been evident for, I'll say, 30 years, that if you looked ahead geopolitically, and you ask the question, where is the world going in terms of great power politics and all the rest of it? The answer was the one true peer competitor that will face the United States in the 21st century is China. And if you then ask the second question, where will the collision between China and the US geopolitically occur? And I think the answer had to be Southeast Asia, and more specifically, right down the middle of the South China Sea. And so what we're seeing now, I think, is a broad sort of recognition of that. And it's not just in the academic sort of book world, it's also in the world of public policy and government. So that's a good thing. A second good thing is that I'm on the same panel with Yun Sun. This country has a wealth of very fine China analysts and sinologists, but there is none better. She's in a class by herself. So I have great respect for Yun. On the two quick initial points, and obviously these are subjects that are so rich, we could go on literally for hours and not exhaust them. So to try to cram this all into a few minutes is a sort of bridge too far, but nevertheless, that's what we'll do. One thing that sort of overview thought that occurs is, with regard to the relationship. Southeast Asia has gone through, I think, at least 4 broad phases in its relationship with China. Just tick them off. Ancient times, a lot of people will be familiar with the term the tribute system. China, the colossus of the north, to borrow a phrase, looming over Southeast Asia, but remote and distant. And the contact between China and Southeast Asia in 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, 500 years ago was episodic and basically ceremonial, and had China did not impinge on the lives of Southeast Asians in any measurable way. Then came the colonial era, and that began to change in a peculiar, paradoxical way. The colonial powers broke that tribute sort of mythology and relationship that had lasted so long, but they brought large numbers of ethnic Chinese into the region. So now, suddenly the demography of Southeast Asia began to change, and change in important ways that very much shape the contemporary picture. Then we moved to the post-colonial era. Mao Zedong sponsors and inspires and urges on communist revolutions across the region. The region's in turmoil. The Cold War is cold in Europe. It's not cold in Southeast Asia. It's hot. And there is a period in which China is seen as adversary, as threat, as ideologically hostile, and the ethnic Chinese in Southeast Asia as potential fifth columns. Then we move into the death of Mao, the emergence of Deng Xiaoping. China adopts a economic development priority that consumes everything that is shared with Southeast Asia. And we go to a 30-year period, roughly from 1980, when Deng consolidates control, to about 2010, when this is, for Southeast Asia, the best of all worlds. China and Southeast Asia are all on the same page. They're all trying to develop. They're all trying to get rich. They're all trying to modernize. And China is a critical partner in that enterprise. But something else is happening. China is not just developing economically, it's developing national state power. And for the Southeast Asians, the critical question was, China as the regional great power, that's okay, but with what intent? And under Xi Jinping, I think it's become very clear, and Yun, I think basically spelled it out, that China is now has become determined not to just be an economic partner, but to be a dominant presence. And the phrase Greater China now is being used routinely by Chinese officials to refer to Southeast Asia. So this now means, for the Southeast Asian, China has become a strategic, systemic, almost existential problem for the region. And then we can go into how the Southeast Asians have responded. On the last question about the differences between Maritime and Mainland, my reaction to that is, I was interested in Yun's comment that this is a distinction that's quite real for China. I think for the Southeast Asians, it's less real. Southeast Asians are trying to maintain, through ASEAN, a coherent region that speaks with a voice that is shared across the region. And the idea that Thailand will view China very differently than Indonesia is one that cuts across the grain of that. And so I think there clearly are differences, in particularly with the ways the littoral states on the South China Sea coastlines have had to deal with China as compared to, say, a country like Thailand or Burma or Myanmar. But for the ASEAN countries, the Southeast Asian countries, that distinction, mainland, archipelagic, maritime, is one I think they'll resist. And I'll note by an instant in passing, Malaysia is one country that actually bridges that divide.
Well, thank you, Marvin. And just working back to this question of mainland versus maritime, Yun, you did indeed say that China sees mainland Southeast Asia as a natural extension of its own territory, perhaps not literally politically, but culturally and economically and so forth. Some analysts, and I'm thinking particularly of a recent article by Bilahari Kausakan of Singapore, have suggested that in contrary to your perception, Marvin, that Southeast Asians have failed to adequately focus their attention on mainland Southeast Asia, preferring to concentrate on maritime Southeast Asia, where there are in fact outstanding issues with China, like the South China Sea controversy, fishing, undersea resources, and so forth. And he urges his colleagues in ASEAN to write this inattention and focus more actively on mainland Southeast Asia, notwithstanding the importance of maritime Southeast Asia and the leadership role that Indonesia has historically played there. But Yuna, I wonder, if this were indeed the case, would this be something that China would embrace as an opportunity to extend its influence, or does this pose something of a challenge to China? Were ASEAN to concentrate a little more heavily on relationships with China through the Mekong area and elsewhere on the periphery?
Thank you, Bill. That is a great question. I think first, there are systematic reasons why mainland Southeast Asia has been less engaged compared to maritime Southeast Asia, right? I think to begin with, there's an issue of political system and the political development in mainland Southeast Asian countries. Western countries, including United States, do not necessarily approve the military coup d'etat that happens every often in Thailand. Then in terms of Myanmar, we see the Rohingya crisis tainting the reputation and the image of the newly minted political reform or even the NLD government. Even let's recall that Aung San Suu Kyi was a democratic icon, the Nobel Peace Prize laureate that we all embraced before this Rohingya issue really broke up and damaged a lot of confidence and credibility. And then there's the issue of Cambodia, of course. Cambodia very much would love to align itself with China. In 2012, Cambodia was a country that single-handedly blocked the passing of a joint statement from the ASEAN Foreign Minister meeting. So I think there are deeply embedded political roots in terms of the U.S. inability to engage mainland Southeast Asian countries to the level that strategists might desire if our sole goal, our only purpose is to compete with China. But there are local conditions that we need to take into consideration. So for example, if we want to compete with China in Myanmar, that will require United States to have some moral flexibility about the Rohingya issue and about the human rights violations that's being committed by the Burmese military. But is US really willing or able to provide that flexibility? I think that's a very questionable very questionable direction. And I'm also glad that you mentioned that there has to be an issue, right? There needs to be an issue that can string all these countries together. And in maritime Southeast Asia, we could argue that that issue is South China Sea, and not just the Philippines and Vietnam, but also countries like Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore is very deeply involved in that process. And I think among maritime Southeast Asian countries, there's a shared consensus or a shared aspiration that in terms of the maritime domain, they do not want to see China single-handedly monopolize the whole maritime area. And US has played a very useful off-balancer or offshore balancer role in that regard. But we have to consider that kind of consensus exists in mainland Southeast Asia. Even if we use Mekong as the issue to string these countries together, are we confident that countries like Laos and Cambodia will be willing to align their positions, basically like maritime countries have aligned their positions on South China Sea, to align their positions vis-a-vis China? Think about how much economic influence that China has already established in countries such as Laos and Cambodia. And I doubt that Thailand would be willing to pick a side if the Thai foreign policy tradition is going to prevail. And then again, on Myanmar, I think it's very unlikely for this to fly because Aung San Suu Kyi and her party is expected to win in the upcoming election, which means that there will be another 5 years of potentially pro-China, or at least trying to stay neutral foreign policy, the neutralism tradition in Myanmar. And they have made it very clear that they are not going to oppose China. So I think the issue of the Mekong certainly has its utility, but to think that the Mekong will have the same utility to string mainland Southeast Asian countries together, just like the South China Sea issue has strengthened the solidarity among maritime Southeast Asia, I think that's that requires mainland Southeast Asian countries to adopt positions that they may not feel comfortable about? Thank you.
Maybe the most we can say is that the Mekong does flow into the South China Sea. So Marvin, Yun has highlighted some differences among Southeast Asian states in their among themselves. Can you focus a little bit on how these differences affect the ability of the states individually and especially collectively to respond to China?
Okay, let me just sort of free associate here for a second and respond in part to Yun's comments, all of which I agree with. And I also agree with Bilahari, by the way. He's an old friend. I love him like a brother. But my earlier point was about the way ASEAN's aspirations as to how the region will be viewed by China and will deal with China. Now, we've gone from aspiration now deep into the realities. I'll just augment a little bit, I think, of what Yun was saying. Mainland Southeast Asia is a very different thing geopolitically from maritime, in the sense that the threat to, or the challenge to mainland, peninsular Southeast Asia, is in my mind almost organic, and a lot of it has to do with the Mekong. The Mekong doesn't just knit countries together. The Mekong, in my view, is a powerful instrument of Chinese strategy. When China started to build mega dams on the upper Mekong, 10, 12 years ago, we've now got 12, I think, in place. My comment to Yun's your former colleague on the Stimson Center, Rich Cronin, who was doing some of the very early work on the Mekong in terms of environmental impacts and economic impacts, was this is also strategic. Now China has the capacity. Some Chinese sitting at a computer can press a button and stop the flow of the Mekong. If you're sitting downstream, that is a knife at your throat. You don't have to spell it out for Hun Sen. What it means, if the flow of the Mekong, which is the very lifeblood of Cambodia, Cambodian society, Cambodian economy, Cambodian culture, can be literally controlled by China. That means if you're Hun Sen, you kowtow in every meeting with China, and that's exactly what he's done. He's, by the way, extremely intelligent. He's probably one of the smartest people on the planet. And so for China, peninsular mainland Southeast Asia is in many ways a kind of easy target. You don't have to deploy large military formations. You know, even the amount of investment you have to do, well, it'll be positive, some kinds of things. It'll be mutual benefit, lots of infrastructure, lots of IT, so on. Maritime Southeast Asia is a different story. Now you run up against logistical issues having to do with projecting power offshore. You run up against all the commercial lifelines that are vital to China, and you run into the presence of the US Navy. And that requires China to create a very different kind of investment, strategically, geopolitically, and that they have done. So China is now a major naval presence in the South China Sea, in many ways the dominant presence in the South China Sea, has put a huge investment into undersea capabilities, into missile systems, into maritime patrol, into the islands, the artificial islands that are built in South China Sea. Everyone's pretty much familiar with all of that. So it's a very different kind of geopolitical picture. At some point here, and I don't know whether this is the appropriate time, I'd like to sort of play with the Southeast Asian strategic problem of how to then respond to this twin challenge from China on the peninsula, in the maritime space, and whether Southeast Asia really has any whether they have any strategic options that have any promise at all, or whether, and I'm going back to a Stimson event just a couple of days ago, if I understood Jane Perlez's New York Times basically saying, for Southeast Asia, forget it. It's going to come under China's domination, and there's nothing the Southeast Asians can do about it. That's a caricature, but there's a good reason to say that. And the interesting question for me, sort of strategically, do the Southeast Asians, in fact, have an option?
Yun, would you like to take that up as a bit of an intellectual challenge, if not a prognosticatory challenge?
Yeah, I think that's Marvin really raised the core question. We all know that Southeast Asia, well, there's this dichotomy that economically, that Southeast Asia has this deep tie with China, and they don't want to give it up. But in terms of the security, there's this intrinsic innate suspicion of the Chinese intention and what the Chinese are trying to achieve, whether the Chinese are going to block them off as the Chinese superior influence, and then Southeast Asia will suffocate under the Chinese tyranny. I think both are extremely real, and it has created this dichotomy that the Southeast Asia, well, using the simple terms, Southeast Asia depends on China for economic and trade, and depends on the United States for political support and security. I think that is true to a certain extent, but it probably carries a risk of overgeneralization of the strategic intent of all Southeast Asian countries. I think there are some commonalities that probably none of the Southeast Asian countries is willing to put all their eggs in one basket. But I think in terms of their strategy and in terms of their strategic endgame, different countries also have different calculations. For example, Singapore's desired strategic endgame will look very different from what, for example, Laos is trying to achieve. So I think I have no doubt, and I think the Singapore by no means is Singapore absolutely is the country that has a lot of strategic anxiety about China's intention in the region. But if we ask the same questions, do mainland Southeast Asian countries like Laos and Myanmar have the same kind of strategic suspicion of China? I think they do. But when they're offered the Chinese finance or the opportunity, so-called opportunity to development, where funding is available, well, in comparison, funding may not be available from other sources. I think money does talk in a lot of these cases. And that's why I think this is indeed a dilemma. I think the Chinese are meeting the demand of some Southeast Asian countries coming to their domestic need. But at the same time, those financing or those development opportunities do not come cost-free. And there's inevitably a very strong component of the Chinese influence to attach to those packages. I might have a slightly different view from Marvin on the issue of Mekong. I think to begin with, yes, China is an upstream country and mainland Southeast Asia, they're the downstream. And looking from that perspective, it seems as mainland Southeast Asia is completely at China's mercy, that China can turn off the water whenever they want to. But in reality, under what condition would China do that? I think that's one question. Two, how much of the inflow from China constitute or make up for the whole flow of the Mekong range? And I think the number varies from dry season to wet season. Some quote as high as 30%, some quote as low as 10 to 15%. So I would say that if Cambodia is running out of water, we can of course blame China for it, but we also need to take into consideration that through its all range, the Mekong has flown through many countries before it reaches Cambodia. And this really raises an interesting question as for how do we manage transboundary water issues? That when a river that crosses multiple countries, the upstream countries naturally has the advantage because it flows through China first. But what is the best management mechanism for that system? Or do we believe that that hostility, or if we turn this issue into a hard security issue, can we make the situation better for the lower Mekong countries? Meaning that can we force China to comply? Or what is the best strategy to shape China's behavior? Or we believe that shaping is impossible to begin with? I don't think there's one correct answer to these questions. And I think also for Southeast Asian countries, they're probably also looking at the result of the US presidential election to determine what their next step will look like. There's a lot of watching going on. Thank you.
Indeed, there is a lot of watching going on. Marvin, did you want to respond?
Yeah, there's a lot here, obviously, but let me sort of move away from the Mekong for just a moment and sort of focus on the I'll call it the strategic problem that the Southeast Asians have, both mainland and archipelagic or maritime. As Yun indicates, I think as everybody knows, China's economic presence and economic value to Southeast Asia is overwhelming, and it's growing rapidly. Just looking at a couple of things on the sort of steep upward curve of Chinese IT investments into Southeast Asia. A lot of Chinese technology firms finding their opportunities in China now constrained. Their opportunities to the international markets and networks through Hong Kong constrained, now are turning to Southeast Asia as the obvious opportunity. So the economic piece of this is huge. At the same time, the strategic maritime, particularly maritime security threat, China flooding parts of the South China Sea with fishing fleets, China is in one case sinking a Vietnamese fishing boat, rejecting the position of Southeast Asian states to their own claims in the South China Sea, lots of intimidating behavior, lots of buildup of potential military capacity, maritime patrols. Just recently we had a demonstration of medium-range ballistic missiles, so-called carrier killer missiles fired into the South China Sea. I mean, the beat goes on and on. Okay, if you're a Southeast Asian leader, how do you deal with this? Or you basically just fold your tent and say the game's over. The Southeast Asians have some very capable people on this front. The Singaporeans, and Bilahari Kausikan is a premier example, are world-class in terms of strategic thinking. And what's emerging, I think it's very interesting, is for, if you want to put a single label on it, it is a hedging strategy. Okay, that's not too remarkable. That has a balancing element into it. But what we're seeing is a strategy whereby Southeast Asian states are, one, trying to build up their own military capacity, not to face off against China, but particularly to maintain what the military calls domain awareness of what's going on in the maritime space, not to be simply without any capability at all militarily. And secondly, they are relying, and someone coined the phrase lawfare. You're seeing increasing numbers of statements coming out of ASEAN summits, out of ASEAN events, out of governments, basically insisting that whatever happens in Southeast Asia, particularly in the maritime space, will be done under international law, consistent with international law, consistent with the law of the sea. So, for example, the code of conduct, which everyone will be familiar with, has been under negotiation forever. We had a recent statement by the Vietnamese chairman of ASEAN in this year, saying that any code of conduct that's agreed to must be consistent with international law. It must be consistent with the law of the sea, and it must have international buy-in and endorsement. Now, that is a strategy to basically wrap the Southeast Asian security situation in the international community and international law, and force China into a position of saying, do you support international law or not? And if forced to do it, the Chinese will de facto say, no, we don't. And that will create its own problems. So you're seeing I'll use the phrase lawfare strategy on the part of the Southeast Asians, and I'll argue is pretty smart. And the other component, and we'll just leave it, just state it, is the role of the US and the US military, because that's what we're talking about here in the maritime space, as a counter to China. And every senior leader in Southeast Asia will go to bed every night wondering whether or not, at the end of the day, over time, they can depend on the US military being present with sufficient capacity to face off China in the South China Sea. And that is an open question, and the election just referred to will have a lot to do with the answer. But a lot of it has to do ultimately with capacity, China's capacity. Now, China has something like 20-to-1 advantage of surface ships in the South China Sea that can shoot something. That, if you're sitting at US Pacific Command, is a problem.
That's an interesting place to leave that, Marvin. In fact, my last question before we open the floor to questions was, how does the U.S. figure into China-Southeast Asia relations? But we are edging into that space that I wanted to leave for audience questions. So perhaps I could ask Yoon, if you could answer briefly on a very large question, how does the U.S. figure into China-Southeast Asia relations?
I think from the, I'll talk purely as a China analyst and talk about the Chinese perspective and how they look at Southeast Asia. I think the Chinese see that U.S. presence, or the U.S. pivoting, starting with the Obama administration back to Southeast Asia, although some would argue that U.S. never left Southeast Asia, is an attempt to encroach into China's traditional sphere of influence. And the case of Myanmar's political reform, the democratization, was particularly seen as a dangerous trend that could start a dominoes effect in mainland Southeast Asia, with potential implications for China too. And then looking at the South China Sea, I think the Chinese view, and I think the Chinese genuinely believe it, is that the issue of South China Sea has been internationalized, it has been securitized, politicized, and also externalized. So as these four, the result or the consequences of these four trends, what the Chinese are seeing is that U.S. has used the issue of South China Sea to entrench itself into the security dilemma and making it worse, making it basically insolvable at this point. And I think there are many counter arguments to what the Chinese are saying, but we also hear criticisms from some of the Southeast Asian countries, right? So for example, Maritime Southeast Asian countries, Filipinos are still complaining that U.S. did not come to their aid when China launched their actions in the Scarborough Shoal back in 2012. And I think that memory is still lingering on in the mind of Manila. And then in terms of the U.S. target in South China Sea, what is U.S. trying to achieve? Is U.S. trying to facilitate a solution to the dispute in the South China Sea? Or U.S., like U.S. government has stated, that our goal is to protect our freedom of navigation? So I think these type of different goals or different motivations also play into how much trust or how much confidence Southeast Asian countries have about the U.S. capability and U.S. commitment and where U.S. comes from. So so I think, yes, Southeast Asia is very much defined as a battleground between China and the United States. Thank you.
Well, that leaves us with a great many issues to discuss. And Courtney, I'd like to ask you to help us with the questions of our audience that may indeed help us go even further into this.
Indeed, and we have quite a few questions and probably won't have a chance to get through all of them today. So in the interest of time, I will ask a couple questions that are broad and then ask a couple questions that are targeted towards individual countries, and I may combine a few of them as they were asked. So I should just note up front as well that there's been a lot published by the Stimson Center on the Mekong issue, so I would advise and I recommend anybody who's interested in digging further into some of those questions about the Mekong River can sort of explore what's been written on that subject, and I'm happy to drop some links into the chat. So we had one broad question asking sort of about Chinese perceptions in the region. So while official Chinese commentary often blames non-regional actors for fomenting tensions in individual countries in Southeast Asia, the question is whether there's any recognition among policymakers or other stakeholders that China's disregard for some of those competing maritime territorial claims or other concerns is reanimating attention to its growing power and concerns over China's growing power directly.
Will be for me.
So that one was open to the entire panel. So I would suggest you and perhaps you go ahead and give a response first, and then Marvin and Bill might have additional thoughts.
Yeah, I think this probably most immediately pertains to the 2016 ruling, the court ruling regarding the South China Sea, and how China has rejected as a result of that ruling and mobilized basically a political campaign internationally against that result. So is there recognition in China that this is damaging their national interest? I think there absolutely is. In fact, there is a debate, there has been this debate as for whether China should have objected to that international process, and whether China should have rejected the result of the international ruling, knowing the soft power or the reputational risk and the damage that it has caused for China. Which is why that I think this year, if you recall, back in May, there has been this debate in Vietnam as for whether Vietnam should follow the suit to also file a lawsuit against China on China's behaviors in the South China Sea. And this time around, I think a lot of voices, even I couldn't say that they're the mainstream voices, but I would say that they're getting increasingly loud in China, is that, well, China should take on that legal case. That there is not a guarantee that if China refuses to participate, if China participates, China will absolutely lose. So I think that is in another way, in a different direction, a recognition of the damages and of the consequences or the negative consequences that China has suffered from rejecting these international systems or these international mechanisms. Thank you.
Let me add something, and I'm going to stray into Yun's turf here, and so she can slap me down after I finish. But this is in terms of China's thinking and attitudes towards the region, but I think it's perceived this way in Southeast Asia. There's an interesting phrase that was coined by one analyst who referred to great power autism. And what he meant by that was great powers being oblivious to and disregarding of the views and concerns and interests of lesser and other powers. I think there's a lot to that, and it's particularly, and I'll be argumentative here on treacherous ground, is particularly true of China. And a couple quick anecdotes. I had a conversation a few years back with a longtime friend who's a senior intelligence agent officer for one of the Southeast Asian countries, shall remain unnamed, ethnic Chinese. And in the course of the conversation, he says, I'm Chinese, I speak perfect Mandarin, I look Chinese, I meet with my Chinese counterparts in the intelligence world all the time. And they treat me as if I'm one of the family. And so they're very open with me. They just continue to talk as if I'm part of their group. And he says, what comes across is the utter contempt with which they view the Southeast Asian countries and their Southeast Asian counterparts. And he says, I keep wanting to raise my hand and say, wait a minute, I'm from the region. But I don't say anything. I bite my tongue and I keep quiet. But he said it's very striking. And it called to mind another quick anecdote. A class of mine, I was teaching at Johns Hopkins SAIS. I had a Chinese woman foreign service officer in the class. I liked her a lot. She was great. And we were having a conversation, this was a few years back, after class, got onto South China Sea, Philippines. And I made some comments about Philippine attitudes. And she looked genuinely shocked or surprised. And she said, you don't really take their viewpoint seriously, do you? And I said, well, actually, yes, I do. And this is a professional diplomat. It was inconceivable to her that she would take the Philippines seriously. So there's a built-in problem here. There's an extreme asymmetry in the way China sees the region. Call it, a hegemonic mindset. I don't know what label you want to put on it, but I think is an important part of the dynamic of what's going on. And the Southeast Asians see it, and they don't like it, and they recognize it for what it is.
If I can,
sorry, go ahead, Yun.
Follow up on that, I absolutely agree with Marvin. This great power autism is particularly evident in China's behavior towards Southeast Asia. And we know that in the Chinese traditional Confucianism, there's this very biased position about basically all the countries or all the peoples that live on China's periphery. And I think the current administration in Beijing tends to inherit a lot of that. And in that sense, I think the counterbalancing effect of the US presence is not only important, it's almost critical for the region. Because without, it ties to the other question that Bill asked, how does China view the United States in the region? Well, the Chinese hate it. But I think that's why the region embrace it. Because without some sort of counterbalancing or the presence of another major power, the Chinese will not take Southeast Asian complaints or their views seriously. So only because, well, maybe not only, but with the US presence and with the US influence to counter what the Chinese are trying to do, I think it creates this external pressure for China to be more careful and to be more, to better calculate what is the cost of their behavior and what is the benefit, and whether there's external cost to be paid in that process. So I think from that perspective, the role of the US is almost central to the future and to the security of Southeast Asia. Thank you.
Now, Courtney. Because
all right,
we're now
so
falling a little behind.
Yes, our last broad question. With all of the differences in resources and interests between the different Southeast Asian states, how does one expect them to work together to sort of counter Chinese engagements in the region or others? And what is the role of ASEAN in this process, particularly regarding regional integrity moving into the future?
Marvin, what do you think?
Well, that's a huge question. I'll just respond very quickly. I mean, the question identifies the problem. For the Southeast Asians, the effort is to try somehow, with constant effort, to knit together the region sufficiently so that it speaks with one voice internationally on critical issues and can negotiate common agreements on free trade agreements, things like that. In the Western sort of mindset, maybe particularly American, there's been lots of sort of criticism of ASEAN over the years. You know, it's a talk shop, a cave of winds. You know, they meet to put on funny shirts, sing songs. It's, you know, sort of a, you know, it's not a serious thing. I will argue, I always have argued, ASEAN is a serious thing. I mean, these 10 countries that make it up are very diverse. We sort of scratched the surface of that, but you start, you know, the difference between a Laos and a Singapore is, you know, is about as vast as you can get. And but the region, you know, the old phrase, we either hang together or we hang separately. The perception in the region is we've got to figure out a way to hang together in our own mutual benefit and survival is real. And I would argue ASEAN has done, under the circumstances, remarkably well. And it's not a paper mache, you know, facade. It is a real thing. And one last final thought on that score. There's a phrase that was coined, Carl Deutsch, a political scientist, MIT, years ago, referred to security communities, where you have states that have a tradition of conflict that work out agreements that whatever differences they have in the future, they will not go to military solutions again. And ASEAN was at its beginning a security community, and it has been one. It has successfully maintained the peace and sort of stability in the region while doing quite a bit on the economic front, free trade and all the rest of it. It's been remarkable.
My thought is that previous senses that ASEAN could in perpetuity or something close to that operate as a single security entity are clearly, those thoughts are ebbing, but that the purpose of ASEAN is more domestic than regional, in the sense that the knitting together goal of the states is to preserve their individual autonomy. They may function successfully as a group, and they may not, but their own measure of ASEAN is how it guards their own autonomy in these tortuous waters between major powers. In any case, Courtney, we certainly have time for a couple more questions.
All right, well, I'm going to combine a few different questions here. We had a number of questions on individual countries. So I'm going to ask one question on Indonesia and one on Myanmar. So the question on Indonesia, Indonesian analysts often seem to assume that China will spare Jakarta some of the assertiveness that has been paid out to Vietnam and the Philippines, not only because the two countries don't directly have overlapping claims, but also because Indonesia is the largest country in ASEAN. It's often viewed as a leader in ASEAN, and there's this perception that China views it differently. So this question was specifically directed to Yun, asking about assessment of that assumption, as well as a more broad question on what does the future hold for China and Indonesia's relationship. We also had a similar question looking sort of at the future opportunities for Myanmar, looking at specifically the concerns inside Myanmar over major Chinese investments such as the Myitsone Dam. How does this influence China's relationship with Myanmar, and what opportunity is there for the United States, given its history of engagement in the region, and particularly with Myanmar, had been limited due to sanctions? And that question was addressed to the entire panel.
You.
I think on China and Indonesia, this relates to what Bill said about, and Bill and Marvin said about ASEAN, right? Indonesia has been regarded as its natural leader, and Jakarta hosts the headquarters of the secretariat of ASEAN, and in Indonesia has been hoped to play a bigger leadership role in the region, not only in terms of the regional organization, but also in terms of the region's relationship with China, and especially in the issue of the South China Sea. But I think for at least for the past decade or so, what we have seen in Indonesia in their strategy towards China is not up to the expectations that a lot of people have had. And I think there are different reasons. You could say that Indonesia does not have that foreign policy aspiration or maybe that aspiration only exists rhetorically on paper, but in reality, it doesn't have the desire or the capacity to really carry that regional leadership role. But in terms of its relations with China, we know that at the very beginning of the Belt and Road Initiative, Indonesia is actually the country where Li Keqiang visited and announced the Maritime Silk Road. It was almost like the commencement of the Maritime Silk Road from the Chinese perspective. And Beijing had hoped that Indonesia could become a pivotal place for China's maritime strategy, not only in the South China Sea, but also across the region in the Southeast Asia and between the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. But I think none of that really transpired. And the most important project that China has reached with Indonesia, the Jakarta-Bandung Railway project, which was signed, a number of years ago, it has encountered a local opposition, land allocation problems, and also other civil society oppositions to that project. So the project never really took off. So I think for the China-Indonesia relations, I think there probably was more hope from China, but very little has really transpired on the ground. But I know that Murray has had a very full, comprehensive analysis of that relationship in his book, and Murray will be speaking on this forum in November. So that's probably a better opportunity to unpack some of the details. In terms of Myanmar, I think it is certainly true that Myanmar does not want to be counted as in the Chinese basket. They had that experience before 2011. I think Myanmar would never want to experience that again. So even in the high days of Myanmar being criticized and condemned by the international community for its record on the Rohingya crisis especially since the August of 2017, I think Myanmar has still been trying very hard to resist the Chinese push for mega infrastructure projects through its country. And at the minimum, such projects, if it's going to be adopted, it must meet the financial security standard the Myanmar government has come up with. And also, the size cannot be what the Chinese dictate. And that's what we have seen in the Jiaopiu Deep Seaport project, where the project is basically slashed 85% from its original plan. And I think in this process, I have to say again that U.S. actually played a pretty important role, because it was with the U.S. technical assistance to deliberate the implication of the Chinese loan proposals and the Chinese financing proposals that really helped the Burmese government, the current Burmese government, to understand the implications and the impact of the Chinese projects. So I think looking ahead, China will still push its effort in Myanmar, but probably not through the mega infrastructure projects that we have seen in Laos or for example, in Cambodia. But these projects will be more small and mid-sized projects that's tailored to the comfort level of the Burmese government. But it's definitely not a question between yes, Chinese money or no Chinese money. There's definitely a gray zone in between that the Burmese are still accepting the Chinese investment, but just not the type that the Chinese had intended to push. Thank you.
Marvin, you have about 30 seconds before we have to pull the plug, as it were.
30 seconds. Two just quick comments. Indonesia, continuing priority though for China. Wan Lee, foreign minister, was just in Jakarta. We're going to use Indonesia as the rollout for a Chinese coronavirus vaccine available to the region. I mean, is a tangible evidence of continued Chinese sort of thoughts about the importance of Indonesia. On the other hand, apropos of Yun's point, the president of Indonesia, Jokowi, in his second term, is a domestic politician focused on domestic development, domestic economics. He is not interested in geopolitics. And the Indonesians have long had this illusion that somehow they were not a party to the South China Sea problem because the Natuna Islands were outside the Chinese 9-dash line, conveniently overlooking that the Chinese claimed fishing rights within the EEZ of Indonesia. So that's an ongoing, unresolved sort of tension. But Indonesia has no stomach to assume the sort of geopolitical leadership that potentially it could. The president of Indonesia just doesn't want to do it. On Myanmar, I'll just note that historically, way back, I had some contact with the Burmese military, and that's in the period when Yun was referring to. They were in quote unquote the pocket of China. The Burmese military made it clear they did not like it, they hated it, and they were looking for a way out. And I agree with you, and I don't think they'll want to go back there.
Well, I regret, thank you, Marvin, and thank you, Yun. I regret that we have reached the end of our very brief hour. I want to thank both of our panelists very much for your your brilliant work. We really appreciate it. I'm sorry we did not get to everyone's questions. If you send the question to me, I'll pass it on to a panelist. I'm happy to do that. We covered a lot of territory today, but much more can be said. We only got halfway through my list of topics, so we'll have to do this again. There's more to be said, but we're not going to be able to say it today. Please join us next week, Wednesday, October 21 at 10 o'clock in the morning for our webinar on the Philippines' relations with China and the US. Our panel, Professor Renato Cruz de Castro from De La Salle University in Manila and former US Ambassador to the Philippines, Tom Hubbard. And the following Wednesday on October 28 at 12:30 p.m. for our discussion on Burma with former US Ambassador to Myanmar, Scott Marcio. Please visit our brand new website at the Southeast Asia Forum website at www.stimson.org. You'll find it under the Southeast Asia Program header. Thank you all for participating. We enjoyed